The Fires of Cerran. Written by A.J. Collins. Narrated by Naiya J. Prologue. Looking out from the parapet with the morning sun rising across to the east and the grass covered in a thin layer of morning dew, Lord Commander Asan Mar inhaled a long and thoughtful breath. To either side of him stood 50 archers, spanning across the entire expanse of the northern wall of Erangel. Behind them, standing ready against the cool morning breeze, an infantry of 12,000 men stood in perfect rank, bolstered by cavalry which now were pushed against the raised drawbridge. In the silence, Mar now turned and looked down to his men. "On this day, with the will of the gods and strength of our souls, we shall take what is ours. We shall amend the atrocities which have bled these lands dry, and we will begin a new, true kingdom," he proclaimed, his low voice echoing around the court, his words carried by the wind and flying off into the distance like birds in spring. Beside him stood his most trusted advisers, 3 lords of the West who had come to this man in hope of victory against the crown. The men roared in mighty unity, and the sound of boots smashing hard into the stone ground beneath them reverberated around Erangel like no sound had done before. Mar smiled. His long auburn hair fluttered softly as the wind began to pick up, and in the distance, the sound of drumming finally began to arrive. "They are here, my lord," Castor Azamara said through gritted teeth, his gaze never faltering from the horizon. Mar turned to face him, and putting a heavy hand on his shoulder, he shook him slightly. "This day shall be remembered until the end of days, my friend. Your children will sing songs of you, and so will their children, and so on," Mar said gladly. He took his tankard of ale and took a final gulp before throwing the thing out into the moat below. The drumming slowly rose in sound, until at last the faint silhouette of men came over the hills and began to march down into the green valley below. "How many?" Mar asked quietly. 25,000, we believe, my lord," replied Sir Wexford Barrick, his large, imposing frame only accentuated by his thick golden armor. Mar nodded. He showed no fear. It was too far gone for that. Death was inevitable, whether it came today or in 30 years' time. Either way, it would come for him. But he had come too far now, done too much to back down. A letter had been sent, signed by the king's own hand, with a final peace offering and a promise that they would live should they surrender. Mar had laughed, spat in the paper, and sent the message back to Cereborn within an hour of its arrival at Erangel. But as a distant hill gave way to the marching men of Cereborn, Arisen, and Teuton, the same could not be said for those who were closest to Mar. Sweat began to bead from Elmore Claiborne's brow as he stood, longsword behind him, staring out into the now shimmering mirage of men. A young man, only now in his 24th year and soon to be wed to Elsara Cordosi of Cyranos, he had seen little in the way of war. Yes, he had been trained in swordplay by his father and his uncles, but those were men who never pierced his chest when he moved his shield too clumsily, or sliced his arm when he attempted to balance himself atop the squelching mud of the courtyards of his youth. They had cut him just as they had been by their own father, for a boy must know of the true dangers a sword possesses. But this was different. This was war. They watched closely, every man with clear eyes upon the battlefield. The grass, now shaken of its dew, swayed softly in the breeze. Trumpets rang clear, and the drumming came to a sudden halt. The enemy stood in clear lines, 6 clear cohorts, 3 lines of light troop. There were perhaps 1,000 or so on horseback. A light cloud of steaming breath rose into the clear morning skies, drifting between the banners of Cereborn and its allies. The valley seemed so small against such a backdrop, and the lands beyond seemed to shrink beyond recognition, as if locking the 2 sides in place until one came out victorious. Above the rows of men, riding down the hill and into the valley came a small procession of riders, 6 men in total, and each well known to Asan Mar. Broden's steed was the finest in the country, a thick, purebred destrier with a long, shaggy mane of black, uncut hair. The king wore his signature golden armor, a mid-length blue cape draped from his shoulders to his waist. He watched closely as the riders cut through the lines of men before stopping a few feet in front of them. The king unsheathed his sword and held the grip tightly as he pushed the thing into the air. A thunderous rapture returned from his armies. "We do not surrender. Remember that. We do not surrender," Mar said to the men beside him. And as the men duly nodded, he grasped his salad and slid it across his face, the metal cold against his skin. "Archers, ready!" he sounded, and a moment later, the sound of bows pulling back echoed around the parapet. From the valley, a line of men began to advance upon them, and horses galloped at full speed ahead. Mar focused on Broden's horse, still against the sea of men that now swarmed the land before him. "Archers, fire!" The sky darkened momentarily, and the grass was dulled as the sunlight was blocked out by the barrage of silent arrows as they fizzed across the sky before slowly falling. Men began to fall, and to Mar's eyes, several horses either bolted or threw their riders as they scared or were pierced by the hellfire that rained above them. But still, the stream of men advanced, and though the field now was dotted with fallen men, the forces of Cerran still appeared undeterred. Mar seemed to only blink before another wave was quickly sent from the parapet, skimming along the morning breeze like a bird above the sea. And again they fell, only this time they seemed to find far more men. A few struggled on, perhaps pierced only slightly and now overtaken by the vicious lust for war. "Open the gates," Mar said calmly, and the order was rebounded down the parapet until at last the great iron chain screamed as the bridge fell into place. Dust flew into the air and began to fall like some dark, untrue snow, and from this dusty blanket was delivered the cavalry of Erangel. It was not long before the two sides met, with those from Erangel running through the men of Cerran on large steeds and coordinating impressive maneuvers that seemed to round men up like fish in a net before striking them down. A large, fierce cry, the cry of over 1,000 men, rippled through the valley in one enormous voice. The two cavalries were well matched, each perfectly trained in the ways of the West, and many men had stood as allies only months before. But in war, there could be no loyalty. Men were pulled from their rides and dragged without mercy along the fields. The crunching and crackling of bones seemed a quiet afterthought to the overall orchestra. From below the parapet, in a rush that seemed almost without tactic or purpose, a slurry of men rushed from Erangel, and the bridge shook, and the wooden pallets cracked below the weight of the wave upon wave. From below the parapet, in a rush that seemed almost without tactic or purpose, a slurry of men rushed from Erangel, and the bridge shook, and the wooden pallets cracked below the weight of the wave upon wave of infantry as they bound like wild dogs along it. Another barrage of arrows fired off, though now the difference between target and friendly fire were narrowed beyond recognition. Against the hills, Broden's forces stood in perfect rank, each awaiting the order for attack, like a well-trained hound at its master's side. Soon enough, the orders came, and trumpets rang out as cavalry and infantry charged down the steady slope and out into the valley. From Erangel, Mar and his commanders stood, though they were now spread apart across its tremendous width, each busy in their own personal battle. Mar turned back and his gaze fell to the courtyard below him, and the place was almost empty. It scared him for a moment. From behind him, an arrow fell to his side, splitting the oak barrel that stood not a foot from him. Turning back, he saw the flock streaming towards the parapet, and for a moment he wondered if he should try his luck and stay standing, for he was sure the gods were on his side. But as he held his arms wide, inviting those 1,000 arrows each to find its mark, he was suddenly pushed away and fell into a small crevice of stairway and thick stone wall. His helmet shielded the blow to his head, but still he felt the force with which he had hit that cold, unforgiving rock. Flicking his gaze back to where he had been, he saw the body of a young archer fall without thought and down towards the courtyard. He kept close to the wall, sliding along it until at last his boots touched the hard earth of the courtyard. To his right he heard the clear sounds of battle, the ripping of steel against steel, and the moans and groans of those who fell. He unsheathed his broadsword, Aaron bore, and shone it like a star, its slight curving blade carefully decorated, and the golden guard shaped into the head of roaring lion. And then he ran, and the thoughts of fear and worry were left to mellow with the dust that his boots kicked up behind him. As he left Arangron, his gaze fell upon the valley, and now the grass was speckled with blood, and bodies of men and beasts littered that once quiet place, and the twisted corpses of both friend and foe were laid around him like some hellish fauna. From above him, a flurry of arrows shot down to the enemy, and he heard the distant roars of his commanders as they rallied the archers to continue the relentless assault upon the men of Cerran. A lone rider came upon him with a vicious speed, but a quick swing of his blade against the belly of the beast saw the rider fall under the weight of the shivering mare. But there was little time to think, as from behind a harsh strike connected to the commander's back, scraping against his hinge. Mar made a quick turn, striking low to his opponent, but being blocked. The two men stood facing one another, Mar on his knees with the strength in his arms as he pushed against the man, a man he recognized all too clearly, even though his face were masked with Arasinian armor. Lord Loughton of Arasen was a tall man, with thick arms and strong legs that seemed to be that of a man beyond the Lord's own years, with soft dark skin and eyes of amber. The Lord was well known for his prowess with a blade. Mar threw his weight forward, disengaging the blades enough to pull himself to his feet as his opposite stumbled. He pulled a shield from beside him and caught a blow high onto it. The wood crackled as the blade sliced it and again pushed back against the almost iron strength of Loughton's blade. The blade released, but in a flash was brought down again. Splitting the shield further, splintered fragments flew through the air and bounced off both men as they tussled in place. Loughton pulled the blade back, ripping it from the shield and yanking against the grip of Mar, who in that moment took a chance to push his shield against the side of Loughton's blade and push his arm upwards before stabbing at the man's raised arm with the tip of his own longsword. The metal scraped together, and the blade slipped down the Lord's counter before a thick stream of blood wept from the gash as the blade fell away. Loughton growled as he pulled his arm away. His grip loosened, and Mar again slammed the shield against the sword. The blade fell to the ground, and the midpoint of it was seeped into the still dripping blood of its owner. The two men stood together, Loughton's weary legs buckling as his arm fell to his side limply. "Fool," said Mar softly, as he prepared his sword for the killing blow. But as he did so, he was grabbed from behind, his sword taken from him by the sudden jerking motion as he was propelled across the field by an unseen force. Crashing against the carcass of a mare, he tumbled across the mud and felt his chest compress against the ground as force took him in its unforgiving stride. Pulling his head up and scrambling quickly for a blade, he found Broden's steed riding off into the crowded plains beyond, with the king swinging a longsword at his right side and cutting down man after man as if he were deadheading deceased flowers in his castle grounds. Mar turned back towards Loughton, now a far-off figure crouched but protected by both cavalry and infantry as they huddled around him and carried him back towards the hill. For a moment, the commander felt safe, as if he could simply lie here and wait until it was all over, and whatever the outcome, he could hide and ensure his survival. A fallacy, he thought. A thunderous booming shook him, and turning his gaze back towards Arangron, he saw the thick wall of the watchtower crumble away into the moat below. A moment later, and another explosion of rock and rubble erupted from his stronghold, and the tower seemed almost to fold in on itself, falling into the water and scattering along the bank. A rallying cry was heard from the hills behind him, and for the first time, he saw the 6 large catapults that were now being loaded with a mixture of large iron cannonballs and rough stone from the northern mountains. He watched his banner, ripped and now falling gracefully into the water, sink without a trace. As the walls shook violently, Sir Wexford Barrack called on his men to fall back into the courtyard below. From his left, a huge blast fired across the walkway, and 1,000 shards of rock and stone flew through the air as a cannonball struck the parapet. The men, though few there were now, began to fall back as he commanded. But the constant pounding on the outer walls coupled with the blasting cannon fire saw many either fall or be trapped. Some, he saw, fell away with the wall itself as the walkway gave way and the watchtower fell down, leaving a spire of thick dust in its wake. Barrack pulled a lackluster band of men down the stairway, but turning to face the drawbridge, he saw that it had, at least partly, been crushed by the weight of the falling tower. The moat surrounded Erringon, and the southern walls beyond were now home to deep, wide trenches that had been dug out and filled with sewerage on Mar's orders. Atop the parapet, a few brave men still stood in unquivering unity as they sent quick, seemingly unending waves of arrow fire across that way and into the valley. "The bridge will hold! Move the men forward! We will give you cover!" shouted a stout, balding man above Barrack. And as the arrows were sent out, and without hesitation, the men ran forward across the bridge, the splintered and smashed panels quivering and creaking as they did so. The band were met, less than 50 yards from the edge of the moat, with heavy infantry from Cerran. His long sword drawn, Barrack slashed at the 3 men that stood before him. He did not see his men behind him. Only the ringing of blades communicated the battles that were occurring beyond his vision. The 3 men stepped back, one directly in front of him with 2 edging towards his side. The man who stood before him held his sword in both hands, his legs wide and strong. The men beside him held theirs along the top ridge of their shields, oval oak painted with the sigil of Cerran. Overhead, the terrible sound of cannonballs whizzing through the skies told the Lord that the destruction of Erringon was almost accomplished. A second quick blow, this time from his right, saw the man edging towards his side momentarily clash his sword with Barrack's. But the Lord was strong, and as he pushed the blade further along the length of his opponent's, he heard the terrible gurgling of the man as he choked on his own blood. Pulling his sword away, Barrack was quick to pull the dying man's shield from his grasp and cover himself from attack at his front, before swinging his sword and clashing blades with the opposite flanking knight. With arm twisted above him, his strength was forced away from his blade and onto the shield, and with a tremendous push he was able to momentarily disarm the man before shoving the splintered wood into his opponent's face. The man was knocked back, his face pricked by fragments of wood, and blood streaked across his face like some terrible war paint. Commander Asan Mar was charged, and a moment later the 2 blades clashed heavily against one another. Sliding his blade down, the steel spitting and growling as he did so, he met the man's eyes for a brief moment. He kicked the man, whose stance showed Mar he had been trained in only the basic arts of combat, and with a brief but decisive swing of his blade, he brought it down upon the man's chest and pushed it deep until the tip of it came through the other side. As the man fell, and with his sword still lodged within him, Mar was tackled from the side. Feeling his breath leave him, he was, for a moment, shook. As he looked up, he saw the blood-smeared sigil of Cerran upon the man's breastplate, and a moment later, the shining tip of his axe as he swung it down towards the Lord. He scrambled around him, the weight of the man pressing down on him, and in the last moment, he pulled a shield from his side and let that take the brunt of the blow. The man pulled at the axe, desperately trying to release it from the grip of the wood. With his own desperation, the Lord scrambled against the man's weight and pushed him from atop him, shoving him away and watching as the man was caught in the path of a galloping steed, being crushed beneath his feet. In the moments after, Lord Commander Asan Mar stood with an almost ethereal quality amongst the hordes of men as they battled around him. He seemed to be in a quiet bubble, surrounded by silence, and in a momentary paralysis against the backdrop of death and war flames. But it faded away quickly, as a band of cavalry began to circle around him. He stood, alone amongst the corpses of his fallen friends and foe, bruised and bloodied, but with a sword still clasped tightly in his hands. The horses cantered about him, tightening the circle until at last they stopped, each beast within a pace of the other, and the riders pointed out to the man's throat. The riders, 6 in total, wore black solid plate armor, and on the chest they bore not the emblem of Cerran, but instead that of a black arrowhead that was embossed in with silver trim. "Surrender, Mar, and perhaps the rest of your men will be spared," said a low voice from behind one of the dark helmets. Mar turned to the rider he felt the voice had come from. A half-smile was hidden behind his bloodied helmet. "Lenren, my friend," the Lord Commander returned. "You are no friend of mine," Lenren returned quickly, spitting his words from behind his own mask. Mar's gaze flickered from one rider to another, assessing them one by one and slowly nodding his head. "The Black Archers of Cerran. I should have known that Broden would send his dogs for me, though I must admit my surprise that it did not come sooner." Lenren dismounted, and the circle widened slightly as stood beside his mare. The lances did not lower. "Broden requests that you surrender, and that you should accept his terms, that you may, after a trial, be spared," Lenren said. Mar pulled off his helmet, throwing it to the ground as if it were nothing to him now. From behind the horses, he saw the carnage that had unfolded, how the grass seemed almost to be burned with blood. His men, or what remained, were being rounded up by light cavalry, and those who attempted to fight were quickly slain. "A trial? What good is that to a man who believes so little in the men who would sit and judge him?" the Lord replied. Lenren pulled his own helmet off, resting it against his side. His sword, seemingly having not seen action at all, swayed against his hip. "Regardless, the king is supreme in court. If he offers you a fair trial, then a fair trial is what you shall have," the archer returned. The two exchanged tired glances. "I will see no fair trial. Neither will I see my name be dragged through the mud by a king who serves only his lords and not his people," Mar spat back. "The king had no choice but to do as he did. The Welling provided him with information, and as he is bound by his crown, he ensured that his people were starving," Mar retorted, taking a step forward but quickly retreating as the lances sharpened focus on his neck again. "Broden took crops from those who faced the harshest winters we have ever known. And for what reason? So his men could spend another 6 months fighting wars against the warlords and Mare?" The Lord Commander's eyes drew close to tears. He stared down at the bloody ground below. His quivering lip betrayed his overwhelming emotion. "Tens of thousands have died for this rebellion," Lenren replied after a few moments, though his voice was low and quiet now. He signaled the riders to lower the lances, which they did begrudgingly. "My men have fought valiantly, and for that there will be a place for them with the gods. And when those poor people die at the hands of your king, it will be us who takes them to everlasting peace. But you will never find your seat. You will wander forever in the lands of the gods with no place to rest, until the skin from your feet is blistered and bloodied, and you will do so for the rest of eternity." Lenren did not respond, but his gaze fell from the man, and did not return to him for the remainder of Mar's life. 3,000 men were taken as prisoners from that dreadful valley, once bright and lush, but not squalid and feared. 6 months of rebellion, which had begun in the eastern port towns, had ended with a flock of perhaps 1,000 crows as they came down to feast on those who had fallen that day. Carts came through in the hours that followed, mostly those of the Yellow Sisters, as they gave aid to those who were injured or near death. And in those moments, the commanders of the West shuddered as they watched these yellow-robed priestesses as they wandered the battlefield, blessing the bodies of the fallen and tending to those who were in their final moments, rather than try to save those who were teetering on the delicate, slim edge of the mortal world. As the sun began to fall beyond the hills, and the wind softened down into a gentle tide that seemed intent on wiping away the stain that was that day, Brodin and his commanders cantered along the edge of the moat leading to Erangel and surveyed the ruined visage in all its former glory. "A fine place this was," said one man, older and having memories flood through his mind of time spent dancing and singing in the halls that now lay crumbled beyond the walls of that place. "Perhaps it can be restored in time," Brodin said, though in his heart he knew too well that the financing of such a fortress was beyond the current reach of the crown. The wars in the East had stretched the finances beyond what the Welling thought wise, and with the delay in Brodin's trip to Dai to meet with the Asai Lord to discuss trade treaties, the rebellion had only further plunged the crown further into financial demise. The Master of Coins, now held up in his own quarters in Teuton, was in constant negotiations with the low lords of the shipping ports in the southeast. Progress, the king had been told, was slow, and the chance of a successful outcome that would satisfy all parties seemed unlikely. The low lords had quietly favored the rebellion, though the strength of the armies held by Brodin and his allies was never to be underestimated. And now that the rebellion had been defeated, in the back of his mind, Brodin now thought that perhaps those same lords may soon find agreeable terms to his taxation policies. The former Lord Commander, Asan Mar, shivered as the cold night winds whipped his exposed back with an unbearable, delicate touch. He closed his eyes, though sleep had denied him by the thoughts that now plagued his mind. 7 days had passed since the loss at Erangel, but the trials had been delayed after the king called a meeting of the High Lords to discuss the ongoing campaigns in the east. The guards, who passed by more than they ought to in order to snicker and spit at the falling man, had told him that the gallows were already being equipped with new ropes, and that the king had even requested 3 spikes to be erected in the center of Cereborn Town Square, and that the heads of Mar and his companions would be displayed there until they rotted and fell away, like fruits left over after harvest. And in that darkness, with rats scurrying around, waiting for the time in which the man would fall gently to sleep, the Lord Commander felt for a moment as if he were not alone, and turning he saw it. And more than anything before, it terrified him.